Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. So grateful for the folks who joined me for this virtual pilgrimage through the 21 Things. And the community that I serve, St. Andrew's in Guelph, has been invited since the beginning, way back when, in September of this year when I first started this virtual pilgrimage. I've done another virtual pilgrimage. If you are interested and you've gotten this far in this one, there's another one on our YouTube channel you can find, Me and White Supremacy. Highly, highly recommend that book. And hey, the virtual pilgrimage is kind of interesting just to engage how you're reflecting on it with some of my reflections. I am the Reverend John Borthwick, and it is my pleasure to be able to share this. And we're almost at the end of this interesting, fascinating, challenging book that's teasing out of the Indian Act, an act enacted by our Parliament, the Canadian government, way back when in the 1800s, that continues to exist, and all the different complexities, intentionalities, and challenges that exist within that. So we're on number 19, and it's Forbade Indian students from practicing their traditional religion. And this was in the 1940s. The 1940s. So we're not in the 1800s right now. There was an amendment that allowed it to be in the Indian Act related to this. Forbade Indian students from practicing their traditional religion. And this section of the book is entitled by Bob Joseph, and its days are numbered. And he quotes Duncan Campbell Scott. He's the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. In a way, speaks to perhaps having maybe tighter terms on bureaucrats. This gentleman was not elected. This gentleman was a bureaucrat of the Canadian government and served in this role for decades. Duncan Campbell Scott, it's a name that comes up quite a bit. And here's what Bob quotes him saying. It is the opinion of the writer that the government will in time reach the end of its responsibility as the Indians progress into civilization and finally disappear as a separate and distinct people, not by race extinction, but by gradual assimilation with their fellow citizens. Again, the intentionality, even suggesting that it's not about race extinction, but assimilation, cleansing them of who they are as a people. Disappearing a separate and distinct people. Those are things that should give us pause as we reflect on this 19th thing. Now, what's interesting as well is there was a push, apparently, by a Roman Catholic, but probably, I'm not going to blame just the Roman Catholics in this event. I'm assuming it's probably a gathering of a Christian religious community in the 1940s, just after the war. This is when the church certainly was booming due to the baby boom and everything else. But the quote here is really interesting. There was a push to a parliamentary committee federally in Canada that since Canada was a Christian nation that was committed to having all its citizens belonging to one or other of the Christian churches, he could see, this person in particular, a religious official, could see no reason why the residential schools should foster Aboriginal beliefs. And in fact, another religious leader at the time also questioned whether there was such a thing as native religion. Right. So again, this language of supremacy, this language of singular focus, and amazing that in the 1940s, late 1940s and 1950s, and so for some, this is still a memory for people. This is what you were raised in, what you were steeped in, the stew that you were marinated in, was this vision of Canada as a Christian nation. This is what was imparted to you by your government, by your religious community, by your family system, maybe even in your work culture. A Christian nation. Wow. In 2023, you would be hard-pressed to advocate that Canada is a Christian nation. and to exclude other religious perspectives and certainly spirituality of indigenous peoples would be misguided in the least and inappropriate, certainly racist or culturally exclusive in its worst iterations. So, since the government was running the residential school program, even in the 1940s, it was very much an intensity to increase that religious teaching within those residential schools and eliminate any of those traditional teachings. So definitely a very intentional policy put forward through the government and enforced by the church's collusion and their role in this thing. And when we use the word cultural genocide, this idea of assimilation, not race extinction, so that fine line that Duncan Campbell Scott is trying to play there. What makes you who you are? What goes into your identity? And I wonder if that's what Bob is teasing out, really, right? What goes into your identity? Who you are as a person? If Canada is defining itself in the 1940s as a Christian nation, then you might say that to be Canadian means to be Christian. That's all identity kind of stuff. So if you're not Christian, then I guess you're not Canadian. And so when we think about this, the idea was to eradicate a person's individuality, a person's identity, found in their spirituality, found in the traditions that have been passed on by ancestors, eliminating that from their being so that they can be defined not as Indian, but as Canadian. And again, I think of the pushback within other cultural communities over the years. People who would call them, in my cultural background, the very white cultural background, but in my cultural background as Anglo-Saxons, people still refer to home when they talk about, way home, or I was talking to home, or back home. There's this very strong sense of identity being embedded with Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland. That's who that's who I am. I happen to live in Canada, and I'm Canadian. But there's this other cultural piece. And the part to play within that is this cultural piece embedded, often enmeshed with a religious culture, whether you're Catholic or Church of England, Anglican, or Presbyterian, or United, or whatever that is. It's all embedded in your identity. And so to exclude that, intentionally, through a system where basically saying you can't participate in this anymore. And the trauma that Bob brings up related to how that impacted Indigenous families when the children return home from school and having been indoctrinated in this idea that, this face of yours, this culture, this heritage, this tradition, this spirituality is all wrong, evil, inappropriate, and going back into your own community and looking at your family and maybe some of the customs that would happen there and looking at that with disdain or hating the other, the collision of that within someone's mind, the trauma of that within a young person's mind, of who am I? What is my identity? Yeah. All of this done with intention, all of this done to disrupt and dislocate Indigenous peoples, especially young peoples, from their community, from their identity. And Bob doesn't say this lightly, I don't think, as he ends this particular one, to say that it's certainly considered a contributing factor to the high rate of suicide in Indigenous communities. What we know about suicide for a lot of folks is, if I don't know who I am, what is my identity? What can I lean into? Do I have value? Do people care about who I am? Those things can be massive contributing factors in someone's journey around suicide. Done with intention, legislated. This is the Indian Act. And these are the 21 things that you may not know about it. Thanks for joining me.